Hey, a quick message for those of you who are listening to this episode on Spotify. I have a small favor to ask. Spotify now allows mobile users to rate podcasts. I would really appreciate it if you can take a quick pause to go to the Techly Journal podcast page and leave your favorite show, your best rating on Spotify. It will help me a lot to get this podcast to reach more people on the platform. Thanks a lot. So you have mentioned DORA, and we have also the SPACE author here. So these are the two maybe most important papers that people quoted a lot. I know DORA is quoted even more than SPACE. So let's start with SPACE first. Why isn't it picking up in the industry, like people talking about SPACE metrics? So maybe Peggy, you have some opinions here.
The reason we came up with SPACE really was to encourage the industry and to encourage managers and leaders to not just think about productivity according to things that you could easily measure, such as lines of code or pull requests or code reviews done or features shipped, and to really broaden what productivity means. So all of us, there were many authors on this paper, and together we brought a lot of experience from studying developer productivity and satisfaction together. And we had seen that this word productivity, and perhaps Abi talked about this before when he visited you, I'm sure that he did, that this concept of productivity, what does it mean? It's hard to define. It's an elusive term. And what we found is that it means many different things. And that was why we came up with the SPACE framework, was to show that when you're thinking about being productive, there are really these different dimensions that you need to think about. So we've already been talking about one, right? This importance of collaboration. So it isn't just writing lines of code or shipping features, but it is thinking about how you help others get unstuck in their work, or how you help others onboard to your code, or the effort you go to write code so that others can understand it and leverage that code in their own work, or rushing to do something so that you unblock somebody else. But there's also other aspects to productivity, how satisfied you are. So some earlier research that I did and research that others did as well saw that happier or more satisfied developers also feel more productive and vice versa. So feeling satisfied and feeling happy and feeling joy in your work is important in terms of being productive. And as well, those feelings of being in flow and not being interrupted and really having that joyful experience of writing code and making progress and having impact in your work, those are all important aspects of productivity. Now, in the paper, we do talk about some metrics, and I have come across quite a few companies that are using SPACE for defining metrics. And I'm always a little bit worried when I hear that, because on the one hand, we think that if you are going to define metrics, at least use, and we came up with a number, at least use 3 dimensions, right? Be more holistic. Don't just focus on activity or outcomes such as quality of features shipped, but look at these other aspects of developer satisfaction, collaboration, and also efficiency and flow. And it's good to see that. It's good to see that some organizations are coming up with metrics and using multiple dimensions across SPACE. I've talked to quite a few organizations that are doing so. But it wasn't the main reason that we didn't try to say, here are the metrics, here's how you should define it. It's more about, if you are thinking about productivity and making a change, then you should think about these different dimensions. So, for example, if you're, say, introducing a new code review tool, and you want to evaluate or understand the impact that tool has on developer productivity, then think about it not just in terms of lines of code written or number of bugs when you ship the code, but think about it holistically. What is it meaning? Maybe you're improving the speed of something, but maybe developers are not as happy, right? Or maybe they're not seeing the impact of their work or something like that. So that was the reason, was to try to steer people towards looking at those different things. So I think DORA is quite a bit more specific in what it looks at, whereas SPACE is very broad, very holistic.
Henry, it's an interesting question that you asked, because I wouldn't necessarily agree that DORA has taken off more than SPACE. I do think DORA has had many years ahead of SPACE to proliferate. But to what Peggy was saying, I think one of my personal observations is that SPACE is complex, right? That the point of the SPACE framework is to show people that developer productivity is complex and multidimensional. And I don't think that's the answer people always want. In contrast, the DORA metrics are easy. There's 4 metrics, and they're quote unquote scientifically proven. And I've heard people skeptically refer to them as the easy button for executives to try to measure engineering performance. Of course, we'll talk later about why that's actually difficult to do. But I think SPACE looks at developer productivity holistically, whereas, like Peggy said, the DORA metrics are out of the box metrics that you can use. And I think that's part of the reason why you see many organizations using the DORA metrics and trying to figure out developer productivity still.
So actually, I have similar thought, or maybe my assumption, right? So coming back to our earlier discussion, I think it's about people in the industry still not thinking software development as a socio-technical aspects, and also thinking about what's the easiest metrics that actually I can quantify in the organization, not really looking into people satisfaction or these kind of things. Sometimes it's really complex, like you mentioned, right? Multidimensional. So that's my assumption anyway. But coming back to DORA, right? I know that you have maybe a couple of episodes in your own podcast talking about this, right? How DORA is being misused in some organizations. Maybe you can give some of your summary or thoughts here. What are some of the examples why people ended up abusing or maybe using the DORA metrics wrongly?
Yeah, been able to have really great conversations recently, including with Nathan Harvey, who currently leads DORA at Google and has really interesting perspectives on the misuse and abuse of DORA metrics. But before going into that, I just want to say that we both, Peggy and I, work with Nicole. Nicole is amazing, and DORA was and is still groundbreaking research. So this isn't meant as a critique of DORA, but rather that the DORA metrics, or which were known as the 4 key metrics, have gotten taken a little bit out of context and gotten a little out of control. And what we see today is that many leaders are struggling to actually gain value out of them. I'll maybe just begin with my personal story. I alluded to this at GitHub. At GitHub, we were going along this journey of transforming the organizations, accelerating developer velocity. And like many organizations, our executives said we should measure the DORA metrics. And of course, this was well-intentioned. At the time, the DORA metrics were seen and still are seen as the sort of gold standard of metrics. They're easy. There's 4 of them. You don't have to think very much to put them in place. And my role at GitHub at the time was to actually move those metrics and figure out how to improve developer velocity at GitHub. Long story short is that I ran into a lot of problems with how to do that with the DORA metrics. And the big problem, I think, is that what's gotten missed about the DORA metrics is that they're outcomes and not capabilities. They're not really metrics that you should be setting as targets or trying to optimize in of themselves. And people often talk about the book Accelerate, and they joke that executives only read page 19 and then put down the book. Page 19 is where the 4 metrics are described. They don't talk about the broad swath of capabilities that the book talks about, which is what organizations actually need to be focusing on. And GitHub, the problem was once we had the DORA metrics, the next question was, so what? So how do we actually improve these? And the problem was that the DORA metrics didn't really capture the context of what was happening across the organization or root cause. And thus, what I was left doing is really going around the company, interviewing developers and teams to understand, okay, what is actually slowing you down? And that's part of what led me to work with Peggy and Nicole now on focusing on that exercise, me going around and talking to people, which we're now essentially calling developer experience.
So I really love that joke when I heard about that in your episode with Nathan as well. So people only go to page 19, see the table, right? You have high performers, medium performers, low performers, and you have some kind of a metrics that you can quantify. Where do you categorize? So I guess for leaders, they will just see, okay, where is my team now? And we should improve to the high performer. So I think, yeah, many people don't read fully in terms of paper. And I've read the recent State of DevOps report 2022. I think there are a lot of insights as well. And especially every year, they come up with a different theme, a different analysis. I think those kind of analysis is also interesting. And there are many learnings that we can do outside of just the 4 key metrics. So let's dive into the new paper, right? I think the paper title, I know that probably it will change. So it's more about developer experience, what actually drives productivity, and how to measure it. So maybe a little bit of intro in the beginning. What is this paper about? What is your findings, your insights? So maybe either one of you can chip in here.
The reason we decided to write this paper was to really build on the work we did in our initial research paper. In that initial research paper, we defined what developer experience is and what it's really made up of. And what it looks like in organizations and why it's such a challenge for them to actually improve it. With this paper, we wanted to create a resource that was more practical, something that could easily be applied by leaders and organizations. And this paper really encapsulates both the research findings from our initial paper, as well as the experiences we've now had working with many organizations and partnering with them to help them understand and improve developer experience. And so this paper builds on our experiences and research to hopefully provide a framework or set of frameworks that organizations can go ahead and apply to start measuring developer experience and also start improving developer experience within their organizations.
Yeah, to me, I think the key behind this paper, the first paper was really about understanding the factors that impacted a developer experience and also teased out a lot of contextual characteristics, how senior a developer is and what kind of size team they're working in and their level of management, all of these things that affect how different factors may play a role in their experience. And we also, from that work, identified barriers and coping strategies that developers would use. And the original framework was intended to be quite actionable because it did identify barriers and identified these strategies that developers would use, but it's also hard to put it into play. And so I think this new paper, which kind of distills three dimensions of developer experience into feedback, cognitive load, and cognitive flow, these three dimensions are easier to wrap your head around and to identify how to measure them so that you can make changes and hopefully improve developer experience by focusing on those three things.
So I know that some people probably listen to this episode like coming from a new perspective, right? They may not understand what is developer experience. I forget that we have mentioned developer experience so many times, but some people may not be familiar with it. Maybe if you can do a quick refresher, what is actually developer experience and is there anything changing after this new paper come out?
The high level definition of developer experience that we use is it's a bit similar to the user experience concept that you get from human computer interaction or UX research. And it's all about how a developer feels about, thinks about, and values their work. So it really does look at the cognitive perspective of the developer and these different sort of psychological aspects. And together, those aren't distinct, but together, those insights build a picture of the kind of experience that a developer has. And in particular, the values dimension is really important. And I mentioned this earlier that our earlier work showed that developers, when they feel that their work has impact, they feel more satisfied, but they also feel more productive. And this is really important in terms of motivating them to do their best work. So, developer experience really focuses on how the developer feels and thinks about and values the work. I know I'm repeating myself, but there really are these three pieces to it. And then this new paper kind of focuses on those three aspects and builds on them to see what are the things that we can measure because those are fuzzy, right? How do you value your work? How do you think about your work? It's hard to turn those into things that you could measure or even reason about how you could make improvements. So the three dimensions in this new paper is about really thinking about, okay, what is it we can really measure, understand, and then suggest changes for?
Yeah, I loved Peggy's overview of the scientific perspective on developer experience. I can maybe speak a little bit to the layman's view of developer experience. Developer experience is a buzzword now, and I think it's used in a couple different contexts. So, for one, to build on what Peggy said, developer experience is about the lived experiences of developers. And Peggy provided a sort of rooted in psychology, but a way of thinking about that, which we build on in this recent paper. Developer experience is also, I think, a practice now in the industry. It's an approach. And in the paper, we refer to it as a developer centric approach to understanding and improving productivity. And you're seeing that play out in many different ways. There are now teams out there called DevEx teams. Gartner recently ran a survey and found that over 90% of organizations are either have planned or are establishing DevEx initiatives. And this goes beyond even what we're talking about today in terms of what developer experience is. Developer experience is something that is happening. Organizations are investing in and planning initiatives across the industry.
Right. and the overarching goal why people start to invest a lot in developer experience, because I think it has been proven that productive developers definitely bring a lot of values to the company, and in fact ended up with increased business performance, either profit or whatever it is that you're doing as an organization. Peggy, you mentioned 3 core dimensions. Let's just go dive into those 3. So you mentioned about feedback loops, cognitive load, and also flow state. So maybe, yeah, I can explain maybe one by one what is feedback loops and why this is important for us to think about measuring it.
Yeah, so developers, how they work and the work that they do, they rely so much on feedback. Whether it's getting feedback from the system or whether it's getting feedback from other developers, this is going to impact anytime you make a change in the code or you work on a feature. You need to get feedback that you're doing the right thing, right? That this is heading in the right direction. Whether I'm waiting for somebody to review my code or waiting for tests to run or waiting to get feedback from end users, this is an important part of giving me that feedback that I'm on the right track, right? And so the speed of these feedback loops, and this is what agile development was all about, was increasing that speed, right? So that you would get that feedback quickly and you would know that I'm understanding this correctly, I'm getting the right value, seeing the right value from the work that I'm doing, and I'm meeting other needs. And of course, CI and CD is all about that as well, speeding up the feedback that you get. So the feedback loops was the first kind of dimension that kind of emerged from using the DevEx framework in the tooling that Abi and his colleagues created. And the second one is cognitive load. Sometimes this is also referred to cognitive fatigue. So this is the amount of mental processing that is required for a developer to perform a task. And of course, software development today is a very challenging cognitive task to do. You have to understand a lot of things. A lot of your work is understanding not just the code that you're working on, but also all of the code that your piece of software depends on. And there can be many different layers of abstractions, not to mention all of the tooling that you're using and all of the other things that people in your team are working on. Some cognitive load is good. We feel happy when we have some pressure on us, but if there's too much, then you feel overwhelmed or you get confused and you forget. So this is the second one that's really, really important. And then the third one is this notion of cognitive flow, which I've been looking at for actually over 20 years now, this idea of supporting developers getting in flow. And often people think, oh, that just refers to not being interrupted. But being in flow is a lot more than that. That feeling of being in control of what you're working on, something at the right level of difficulty, feeling like you're making progress, feeling like you're creating something that's worthwhile, that kind of captures that whole kind of flow notion. And that can be supported by many things, such as having autonomy over your work or having clear goals, as well as having that uninterrupted time to do that. So together, these 3 things, they're not independent. They are dependent, right? If you make a change that impacts one of them, that's going to impact the other 2. So together, we feel these are the 3 most important kind of ways that we can make improvements to developer experience.
One thing I would add to what Peggy described is going back to an earlier theme of both social and technical factors spanning across these 3 different dimensions. For example, if you think of feedback loops, again, most people think of feedback loops in terms of the speed of tools or the speed of processes. But in fact, a lot of those tools and processes involve human aspects as well. For example, in our paper, we provide examples of feedback loops and tools, but we also talk about the feedback loops which exist amongst people. One obvious example would be waiting on peers for feedback on code, for code reviews. But those types of feedback loops exist outside of code review as well. There's usually feedback loops involved in QA, feedback loops involved in getting feedback from your actual users and customers or stakeholders. So that's something I wanted to call out. And the same applies for cognitive load and flow state as well. Again, with cognitive load, we like to think of developers scattered across too many tools and systems. But in fact, a lot of cognitive load has to do with communication between people or communication between people via code that is difficult to work in. And as Peggy talked about at the end, flow state is the same thing. It's not just around the sort of mechanical aspect of people being interrupted. It's also about them feeling stimulated and fulfilled and empowered in their roles. Those are all key components that promote a state of flow state in developers.
I hope you enjoyed this short clip from TechLead Journal favorite playlist. If you find this episode useful, please help share it with your friends and colleagues who you think would also benefit from listening to this episode. And if you want to listen more from this conversation, please go back and listen to the original full conversation with my guest. Stay tuned for the next Tech Lead Journal episode, and until then, goodbye.